Here's N.T. Wright to make excuses for God's behavior in the Old Testament.
Okay, let's turn to this very serious issue, which is the warfare passages, especially violence in the Old Testament. We'll come to the Greg Boyd sort of perspective on this in a moment, but for now, Coburn in Tacoma, Washington asks, what are your thoughts on the conquest of Canaan and the instructions from God to his people to kill women and children in the process? I've always struggled to reconcile this, what looks like with the mission of God's people being to love and serve the world.
Well, God in the Old Testament has never been against mass unaliving people, even children. At one point, he allegedly wiped out the entire human population except for one family. Collective punishment is apparently perfectly morally legitimate from an Old Testament perspective.
I'd love to hear how you've wrestled with that and what wider lens, context, or perspective you might have on the matter. And John asked the similar question briefly, how do you explain the horrific Old Testament accounts of God's judgment in the light of the New Testament change of emphasis?
Yeah. I wouldn't quite say the New Testament change of emphasis, because that rather implies that what you have right through the Bible is a set of moral examples. And it's quite clear in many parts of the Old Testament that the story is not being told in any way as a moral example, as this is how you ought to do it, guys.
So God is a hypocrite who wants you to do as he says, not as he does? This seems hard to square with the fact that he instructed people to unalive the Canaanites and the Amalekites instead of doing it himself. He literally prescribes what to do to them. In fact, when Saul spares the Amalekite king and some of the livestock, God tells Samuel, I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. God is apparently disappointed that Saul did not carry out the mass unaliving the way he was instructed to. Additionally, why is God grieved when he's omniscient and would have known before he made Saul king that this was what he was going to do? This passage makes it sound like God expected a different outcome.
And that, of course, that comes to a low point at the end of the book of Judges with those horrific stories, which one hopes that nobody under the age of 21 would ever read, but I'm sure they do.
Maybe the Bible shouldn't be in school libraries then. It's interesting that I finally heard a Christian admit that the Bible is not appropriate for children, but 21? In N.T. Wright's country, not even the drinking age is 21.
And so it's partly a matter of learning to read the Bible in terms of the whole sweep, and then it isn't a matter of, oh, well, the Old Testament says it's okay to do side and then Jesus says it isn't. It doesn't work like that.
Well, no, I don't recall Jesus ever saying that. I don't think that this is God's position. When pressed on this issue, William Lane Craig has admitted to believing that mass unaliving people isn't morally wrong per se. It's only wrong if you do it without God's permission.
And I think all of this comes down to the fact that when God makes the good creation, he calls humans to be his partners in making creation what he wants it to be.
What's disturbing to me about God involving humans in the mass unaliving of Canaanites and Amalekites is that they do it with swords and clubs, when God could just do it by making them all instantly and painlessly magically disappear. Apologists often say that the children would have gone straight to heaven, but even if that's the case, why couldn't God have sent them to heaven in a less horrific way than sending Israelites to do it?
And that's kind of built into Genesis 1 and 2. This is a world designed to work when humans are reflecting God's stewardship into the world. When the humans rebel, God doesn't say, oh, well, goodness, now that they've rebelled, we can't have humans involved with my plan. I'll have to do something quite different.
If God had simply made human beings morally infallible from the beginning, then there would be no evil people to unalive in the first place. God created humans with enough cupidity to be led astray. He didn't have to do that. He could have created Adam and Eve to not find the fruit of the tree even remotely tempting.
God sticks with the original plan, which means that when he calls Abraham as he still is then, God calls somebody who he knows, God knows, and the narrator of Genesis knows, is a very mixed up character. I mean, the story of Abraham oscillates from great moments of faith and obedience to disastrous moments of getting it wrong and cowardice and getting everything upside down, inside out. So faith 1 minute and apparent unbelief the next, and then back to faith the next.
What does this have to do with God ordering the mass unaliving of innocent children?
And so the idea that Abraham is this great hero of faith, when I was younger, people would give me books on the great men of faith and women of faith in the Old Testament, as though the stories were all simple, going from one heroic thing to another. And you only have to think of David and Solomon and so on to see, no, they're not like that, actually. So that right from the start, God's Israel-shaped plan, the Abraham and onwards plan, if you like, has built into it the fact that odd things are going to happen, which is something which God is eventually going to have to take responsibility for.
So the mass unaliving of whole ethnic groups is an example of odd things happening?
And that's why I think the Old Testament as it stands remains deeply, deeply ambiguous. And actually, I think it's one of the things Jonathan Sacks was exploring in his book, Not in God's Name, where you get the Isaac and the Ishmael story. And he points out that the Hebrew words that are used are designed to push the reader's sympathy all onto Ishmael, even though we know that Isaac is the one who's going to come out smiling at the end of the day. And likewise with Jacob and Esau. It's as though the writers of Genesis and the other books are saying, this was how it had to be, but there's a deep ambiguity built in, and I think the Canaanite stuff is the most obvious example of that.
So the Bible, the supposedly perfect, inerrant word of God, was deliberately written as though its author had the communication skills of a tin of beans full of botulism? And why is it that this is how things had to be? Does our supposedly all-powerful God not have the power to have things unfold differently?
But then, when you read it from a Christian lens, part of the meaning of the cross of Jesus, it seems to me, is that the four Gospels tell the story as this is how the whole story of Israel and the world gets funneled down onto one point. And it'll only work, you can only understand it if you say this isn't just the story of a first century human being called Jesus. This is the story of God himself taking responsibility because he's made a world in which this was the only way that things could be dealt with.
Why would a perfectly benevolent God make a world full of things that needed to be dealt with? And how is it the only way these things could be dealt with? Does this all-powerful God not have the power to deal with them in any other way? And what does Jesus have to do with any of this? Is Wright saying that the crucifixion is God punishing himself for ordering the Israelites to do what they did? Why couldn't God have just refrained from ordering that in the first place?
And now he's bearing it all himself. That I find not a comfortable thing, but then the cross is never meant to be a comfortable thing. But it's a way of saying, when I see the story whole and all the multiple tragedies, the Canaanite women, etc., and I see Mary at the foot of the cross and a sword will pierce her soul also, etc., that there's something whole about that, which then with the resurrection says, and now that's been done and we are starting a new world.
Well, it's clearly not a world in which people no longer commit acts of mass unaliving because they believe God told them to. And it does seem like Wright believes that the crucifixion was Jesus punishing himself for ordering all the violence that he ordered in the Old Testament. That's quite a departure from the idea that Jesus died for human sins rather than taking responsibility for his own actions.
And the book of Acts is not about the church going out with swords and staves to beat everybody up. It's about a different kind of mission entirely.
Apparently Constantine and Torquemada didn't get that message. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.